About 1,000 people worked at AFVN throughout the entire conflict in Vietnam, but they came and they went, typically doing a show for 1 year or occasionally a little more if they extended their tours. But there was a voice on AFVN whose show was on the air from 1966 to 1973, and every GI remembers her. She was a Hollywood sweetheart by the name of Chris Noel. Chris Noel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
You played a huge role in the American Forces Vietnam Network in Vietnam. Vietnam veterans repeatedly say that they remember Chris Noel, that you were a big part of the experience in Vietnam. What'd you do?
Well, first of all, I'm always glad that they remember me. And actually, I became the first woman since World War II to broadcast on Armed Forces Radio and have my own show. They interviewed a lot of girls in Hollywood, and I think I was kind of flabbergasted when I found out that I was going to be on the radio. And I started out with George Church III, and I did a show with him called Small World. That's how I started it. And then one day I get a call to go into the colonel's office. So I go in, and he tells me I've been fired. And I said, well, what did I do? And he looked at me and he says, well, you've been fired and rehired to have your own show, which was pretty exciting. And they decided to call it A Date with Chris. And about that time, Elvis had his album out called A Date with Elvis. And so I started with my own show, and it was lots of fun. I had help. I had a producer, and it was very helpful because he would pull a lot of the records until, as time went on, I found myself getting upset because I would want certain records played and they refused to play them. We had quite a band at that time. And, for example, along came Mary, and they said I couldn't play it. And I go, what are you talking about? And they said, well, Mary means Mary Jane, and that means marijuana. You can't play that song. And there were a lot of songs like that they wouldn't let me play. So I hear people say there was no such thing as censorship. Well, that's not true.
Chris, your program, A Date with Chris, was aired on AFRTS worldwide, right? Not just in Vietnam.
That's correct. Throughout the free world.
Was your program produced in Los Angeles and then distributed worldwide?
Yes, it was.
Had you been to Vietnam prior to getting your program, A Date with Chris, on AFRTS?
No, I had never gone anywhere outside of the country except to Mexico once.
You had a very personal connection with the GIs in Vietnam. They listened to you, and it was a very, very deeply personal moment. How did you create that intimacy?
Well, I always pretended like somebody was right there with me, and I would talk to them like they were right there with me. If I made dedications to the guys, I'd make my dedication and talk to him just like he was sitting right next to me.
Well, I hope this doesn't come across as chauvinist, but you're absolutely adorable, and you've got an incredibly seductive voice. That had to help.
At that time, I was smoking, and so it was a little bit more like this. It was a lot lower.
Chris, what was the original purpose behind your radio program?
Well, Armed Forces Radio comes up underneath the Department of Defense, and it's under, I think, Special Services. It's the whole concept is that we are supposed to be bringing knowledge and the feeling of warmth and education to the troops. That's why they would throw in little blips about making sure you're taking your malaria pill, don't come home with weapons, various little bits that would be pre-taped and thrown into the shows. But anyway, there was a real purpose for it. Keeping up the morale in war is a very hard thing to do. And at that time, the thing that seemed to grab them the most was actually to be able to hear a female's voice, an American's voice. I think I could have been 7 feet tall and weighed 500 pounds, and they wouldn't have cared. They just were just happy to hear a female voice, because on the radio was nothing but men. And most of the time it was, the weather today is the same as it was yesterday, and the day before, and last week. And it was it was pretty stilted, most of it. So for them to hear somebody on the airwaves taking it in a different way, putting it out with friendliness, really made a difference.
Chris, you obviously had a positive impact on the morale of the American forces, so much so that the Viet Cong wanted you, a radio announcer, a Hollywood actress, dead. They actually put a bounty on your life. How much was that bounty?
It was only $10,000.
That's pretty significant.
Well, back then it was. That was a lot of money back then. For a Vietnamese person to have ended up with $10,000 would make them very wealthy.
Well, it's also pretty significant when you consider that General Westmoreland and Bob Hope had a $25,000 bounty. That's still a pretty good percentage that you had.
Yes, it is.
Why do you suppose they wanted you dead?
Because I was good at what I did. I was important to the United States fighting man. I gave them energy and hope and positive feelings, and when they were in hopelessness and feeling despair and in a place that they didn't want to be, in some of the places they couldn't even pronounce.
Chris, I read your book titled Vietnam and Me, and you have a couple of stories in there I'd like to address. Tell us, please, about the situation with the POWs who heard your program on the radio and how it gave them hope.
A Special Forces Green Beret brother, John Gallagher from Brooklyn, New York, was captured along with the rest of his team. Since it was the first entire A team captured by the VC, the enemy wanted to use them as an example. The VC kept the 7 white men, 1 Indian, 1 black man, and 3 Latinos in separate 8-foot holes. They had to go to the bathroom, fight off the rats, and sleep in the mud from the rain in a hole that didn't even have enough room for them to lie down. Through the steel lid that covered his hole, John Gallagher could hear the VC's radio. John told me later, every day your voice would come on the radio and I could hear the music. How bizarre to hear a round-eyed American woman's voice on a VC radio inside Cambodia. You made us realize we still had a chance of making it out alive. When I asked him why, he said, because we knew Americans were still there and weren't going to forget about us. We knew they would do something. We knew that we weren't forgotten. Just hearing your voice gave us hope. The biggest thing is you still made us feel a part of home. Knowing that made us want to stay alive. I heard that sexy voice and knew that one day I had to meet this woman. We had never seen you, but we dreamed of you as blonde and blue-eyed until the day 7 of us escaped.
So you played a big role in just keeping them going, giving them hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just those who were incarcerated. You also tell the story about a photo store in New York years later.
Oh, yeah. I had gone and I needed to have some copies of pictures made for something. And I left them there, and I went out and did something and then came back to pick them up. And I remember that the man, the clerk at the photo store, he just kept staring at me. And I didn't think much about it because, like in New York City, there's all kinds of people. And when he was giving me my change, he mumbled something that was like, "Thank you for saving my friend's life." And I looked up at him and I said, "What friend?" He says, "My very best friend was in Vietnam. When he came back, all he talked about was you." He says, I didn't know who you were, but all he talked about was how, if it weren't for you and your radio show and being able to listen to your voice, that he would have killed himself. And that was not the first time I heard something like that.
Dick Orkin, the creator of Chicken Man, told a similar tale about that radio series keeping GIs alive.
Well, yeah, because it does. You give them something that takes them out of their head. There's something else to think about. I mean, it's pretty horrible sitting there wondering when you're in a VC area and you don't have the foggiest idea when someone is going to come out of the bush behind you and slit your throat. And we never knew who the enemy was. In the daytime, the women would be washing your clothes and everyone would be smiling at the GI, and then they'd have it all paced off and knew how many feet it took to get to whatever place they wanted to get inside camp, and they would come in at nighttime and kill our GIs.
It was hell, no doubt.
I think war is hell.
Chris, you visited Vietnam by way of the radio 5 nights a week. How often did you visit in person?
Well, I know for a fact it was at least 8 times. And it was more, but because I never kept a calendar, I wouldn't have the foggiest idea.
You didn't stay in the rear with the gear either. You took your show to the forward operating bases. What was your most harrowing experience in Vietnam?
We always had a Christmas truce. I guess it was 24 hours. Neither side was supposed to fire. Well, we didn't, but that didn't stop the other side. Very early in the morning, right at daybreak, all of a sudden I hear all this noise, and I rolled out of this cot and laid on the floor, and I grabbed my clothes, and lying on the floor, I put my clothes on, and I slipped out. Again, I had no idea where I was. And that's when they told me the truce had just been broken. They were back to firing. But since I didn't know what was going on, I thought we were being fired at that moment. Well, we probably were, but it was just very, very weird. And then other things happened, little things, like being in a place that definitely was being fired on and incoming, and being in a Jeep and being fired on by snipers and pretty much thrown out of the Jeep into a ditch, and being in a helicopter and having it being shot at, being on top of a mountain. I don't know what mountain I was on top of, and having the helicopter come in to pick me up, and it was very dark, and flares are going off, and you could hear the ping on the helicopter as I get behind like a bunker and hug it until it's time, and then they just picked me up and threw me on the helicopter, and having a hydraulic system go out on a helicopter when you're up in the air, and end up landing in a rice field next to a suspected BC village, and just having all kinds of little stuff like that happened. It kind of seemed like the norm.
Chris, did you receive letters from GIs in Vietnam at the time?
Yes, actually, I received thousands.
What was the typical letter? What did it say?
Well, actually, I happen to have this letter right in front of me. It came from 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, Headquarters and Supply Company, 2S4. Dear Miss Noel, today, 19th of March, could be the last day for most of us. We're going to make a beach landing in a pretty rough spot in Vietnam. When you receive this letter, I'll probably be gone from this crummy world. I just want to say that listening to your beautiful voice on radio gives us Marines a big lift. It's just too bad that most people back home don't give a damn what happens to us or the outcome of this war. They just keep on protesting and criticizing, but give no encouragement or support. They don't know that us Marines are afraid and want to live like others. I'm just an ordinary young man, not old enough to drink or vote. I've always been a great admirer of you and was hoping and wishing that I would be able to meet you in person someday. But for reasons now, I can't plan that far ahead. Best wishes.
Well, Chris, I know you were not a member of the armed services, but in many ways, you are a Vietnam veteran. And I want to thank you for what you did.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate it, but I just felt I did what I was supposed to do.